No, it's a new experience. It's like being famous. You know, the world is your.
People bought the game because they really believed in it. You know, we didn't have to sell it to them. There wasn't a, you know, it was belief. They saw it and they believed in it.
I hate when that happens. The world is your what? Your dumpling.
We'd sit together and talk
about stuff.
about school and sports
it just
and
came
stuff.
to us.
It just came to us.
It really just came to us.
I mean, it was inspirational.
Yeah, mainly I'd have to say that it all comes down to inspiration.
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 Yeah. Inspiration is most definitely the key.
So we were signing all the documents, you know, making it official, and all of a sudden we found oyster.
800 years ago, the Jewish people mourned the death of Rabbi Moses Maimonides, the illustrious Rambam. It was Maimonides who cut the precious diamond known as the 13 roots of the Jewish creed. During this octocentennial year, a group of enterprising university students turned to a mysterious etching from the Cairo Geniza to create a mind-bending challenge of faith for the 21st century. The name of the game, Credo 13.
Welcome to Credo 13. I'm Michael Kegel. The sixth root belief of the Maimonidean Creed is that prophecy is real. Now think about it. God actually spoke to human beings with words.
Sixth principle is prophecy.
Belief in what is called in Hebrew nevuah.
Maimonides himself had a very specific definition of what he understood prophecy to be.
Nevuah is translated as prophecy because very, very often the person who experiences nevuah will make predictions of the future.
That's a very minor, actually, function of prophecy.
That's not the essence of what nevuah is. The essence of nevuah is enlightenment and communication which the Navi receives from God.
There are certain individuals that they receive this divine overflow from God.
Where there is a substantive communication, there is information.
You have to be a chacham, you have to be a wise man to receive prophecy.
There is knowledge which is transmitted from the mind of God, if you will, to the mind of the Navi.
It's a connection of the human intellect with the active intellect of God.
When you develop your intellect, you're able to understand certain truths.
Prophecy is simply a belief that God can speak.
God does reveal His will.
God communicates to the human being.
To certain select people.
People who somehow or other are directly addressed by God.
They receive God's word, God's message.
At least addressed by God more directly than us ordinary folk.
The existence of supernatural communication is probably another way of putting it.
It is a fundamental of faith to believe that such communication can exist.
Prophecy is ultimately key to any principle of Orthodox Judaism.
Otherwise, the divinity of Torah is an impossibility.
Because if you don't believe in prophecy, then you no longer have a revealed religion.
Without it, there is no Torah.
In our Credo drama number 6, Jackie guesses that none of the other players will grasp the importance of putting the sky on the bottom as a foundation. But of course, guessing is not the same as actually predicting.
Weatherman says it's gonna rain tomorrow.
I never trust that stuff.
Weatherman says it.
You can't trust the weatherman.
My grandfather was a weatherman.
To me, the weatherman's always come right after Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy.
My grandfather made his first prediction about the weather when he was 6 years old.
I don't see why anybody trusts that stuff.
How hard can it be? Either it snows or it doesn't.
I know you have at least a 50-50 chance.
My grandfather studied under some of the best weathermen of all time.
The worst is when they tell you what's happening right now.
I know. Weatherman says it's cold outside. You don't believe him? Step outside.
Is that some kind of skill?
I don't know.
Well, I always saw the weatherman as more of a marketing device than a service.
My grandfather predicted 2 hurricanes and an erupting volcano.
He
You really believe that stuff? When I was a kid, I wanted to be a weatherman.
What happened?
My 8th birthday. Weatherman says it's gonna be nice. We all go to the park. 10 minutes and it's pouring. My birthday cake was
Everybody
ruined.
makes mistakes.
Yeah, but it's supposed to be reliable.
My grandfather used to say, no weatherman is an island.
Was he drunk at the time?
He meant it's an upward battle.
I thought weathermen were born with the innate ability to detect weather patterns.
Not at all. Some of it is God-given, but most of it is skill.
Are you saying there's a science to predicting the weather?
My grandfather called it a focus.
And you're saying some weathermen are actually better than others?
Definitely. The innate ability has to be honed.
And what of prophecy? An innate ability? A skill developed out of an innate ability? Or even more than a skill?
One thing he is clear about is that prophecy is natural. Just like the world to come is, that is, every individual who reaches a certain level can, by definition, attain prophecy. But God can do a miracle, he says, and prevent this person from attaining the prophecy. But prophecy itself is a natural process.
Which, of course, follows from his notion of the image of God. The image of God for him is the rational capacity of human beings, which is the closest they come to God.
Anyone can attain this, but it's very hard. We have been given a shortcut. We have the Torah, we have ways of understanding, developing our intellects.
There is a source in Maimonides and several sources that the prophet is the philosopher who really divested himself of this worldly concerns and then was in a state of contemplative joy and then sort of eased on into prophecy.
Some do see it like that it's all sort of a system, that it's all built into the system, that you achieve a certain level, you get the prophecy, and it's automatic.
Any human being with the proper prerequisites of kind of moral and intellectual excellence, which at least make you ready for prophecy, but don't necessarily bring it about. He says it only makes prophecy possible, but Maimonides is loath to think that God would communicate with people who are not well developed morally and physically and mentally.
And therefore, he might tend, since the perfect man to Maimonides is the wise philosopher, so it would be only logical, I think, for him to see the ultimate perfection, which is the prophet, being linked to that process.
You connect yourself to God, and therefore certain things knowledge comes to you. So Isaiah, it's not that Isaiah understands certain things, it comes automatically down, as it were, and he can then prophesy. It's not as if God decides, I'm going to send this message.
Rashi says that God is engaged in this constant internal conversation, and Moses overhears some of it. Now you're hearing a conversation. It's an internal monologue of God, of which you're overhearing some. I think that comes a bit close to what Maimonides' understanding is, that you're not being addressed in time, as it were, by God, but you're hearing God uttering the eternal truths to himself.
I think you don't necessarily have to say that you could regard prophecy as much more of a sudden revelation.
Maimonides' whole understanding of prophecy and the way he connected to his astronomy with the various intellects and the active intellect, we don't accept it anymore.
The question really becomes, is prophecy natural or supernatural? And that's a distinction you can end up playing with. Somebody will say, well, any kind of person can figure all this out on his own. That's supernatural.
The Rambam liked right reason, and he liked logic, and he liked the philosophic enterprise.
He believed that the attainment of rationality was the royal road to the knowledge of God. And since simply as a matter of fairness, you would think that only people who are properly prepared should be able to have that kind of experience. The Rambam really emphasized the preparation for prophecy. He adds a proviso that even though a person may be properly prepared, it is then up to God to either include him or exclude him.
He seems to regard the fact of being prepared for prophecy is something which still has to be realized by God.
And why God would or would not do that would remain somewhat opaque from our point of view.
You can have all the prerequisites, and even though prophets have these prerequisites, everybody who has these prerequisites is not a prophet.
It's important to understand what this means, nevuah. It doesn't mean merely that there are certain people that are endowed with great creativity or profundity of thought or intelligence or eloquence. That certainly is true, but that's not nevuah. Shakespeare was a magnificent writer, a tremendous command of language, tremendous insight into human nature, etc. But we would not say that Shakespeare is a Navi.
Why not?
I've always thought of weathermen as elitist versions of self-help phone-in shows.
Are you depressed?
Did you ever
Get the
call
weather.
one of those self-help lines?
No.
I once called as a joke, and I was on the line for 45 minutes.
Was it helpful?
I've never felt better.
Are you serious?
Yeah, it was incredible.
What'd they say?
It was amazing.
Yeah.
Right into my ear.
How unpredictable.
It went right from the phone into my ear.
That's how the phone usually works.
Yeah, but this was different.
Yeah, this time you were paying 50 cents a minute for it.
Shakespeare also had an ear for divine poetry. So why can't we say that God's words enter the ear or the heart in more or less the same way?
When people say, I feel God in my heart, right? How can you distinguish the God in your heart from your own heart?
Obviously, if you reject the belief in nevuah, the Torah cannot be of divine origin.
People like to think of themselves as having this sort of feeling of what God wants from within themselves.
Obviously, nevuah will make greater demands of us than that other type of inspiration.
Well, how do you know it's God speaking versus your own feeling?
Shakespeare can write very, very insightful things, but it doesn't demand of us any type of action, any type of obedience. We are not obligated to live by Shakespearean principles. He was given a gift of creativity, he used it well, but that doesn't obligate us. On the other hand, if God transmits a substantive message through the Navi, and this is made known to us, now we know what God's will is, that does make demands of us.
And God may not always tell me, or I may not always like what happens in that relationship.
You might be very surprised about what God tells you. It's not, coming with a list of particulars, expecting kind of, it's not like petitioning Parliament, and, do it or else, or I won't vote for you in the next election.
You don't always like what another may do in the relationship, but there's a dynamic there. The person may actually be right. With God, it's always right, but there's a very different dynamic in that regard.
The sense that you are dealing with the other, that there's an encounter.
The relationship is, I hate using Buber's terms of I, thou, because I have my own problems with Buber, but it's important to know that you are, and I'm not trying to say I, thou, it's important to you that you are in a connection with another.
I think nowadays you have people that are willing to accept the concept of divine inspiration, but they reduce it to that type of gift. And therefore all the prophetic works, including the Torah itself, really become non-binding, non-obligating, because you've defined divine inspiration in a way that does not obligate.
It has to originate from outside the person, that there is a communication from outside the person. And therefore, it is not just simply some personal perspective.
People's judgments are often distorted by their own motives, by their own peculiarities.
We discover, we gain information. If it's scientists, we do experiments and so forth. In Kabbalah, we may try and read, or we may try and push for inspiration and so forth. But in many ways, we are attempting to understand the truth outside of us through processes that are within ourselves.
Given all the fallibility of the human being, I think the emphasis on transcendence of God really has to do not only with human frailty, but also with divine transcendence. Now, it may very well be that the more aware you are of divine transcendence, the more aware you are of your own frailty.
And it's important to recognize that for Torah to work, it's not just some divine inspiration. It can't just be some sort of good feeling in the human spirit, some idea where he gets a divine, filled with some good divine, feeling or whatever. It has to be that God communicates, and God says, "This is what I want you to do."
If your conception of God is wrong, you can walk around feeling that you're everything that you do, everything that you want is good.
It's a big difference between, being, I'm into spirituality versus I'm into relating to God.
The distinction personal relationship and an impersonal relationship is something that is much more important religiously and much harder to wave away.
Even when God only spoke to Moshe, there had to be, but it was done in front of the nation in certain cases, it had to be clear that Moshe was being spoken to. Even though you couldn't hear the exact words, you had to see that it was very important that the nation perceived a dialogue of some nature. They saw Moshe and something in dialogue. Moshe was not just, hey, I got a new inspiration today. And that's really important. That's what prophecy is about. It's a communication from outside the individual.
Which brings us finally to the question of trust.
Thing is,
yes,
if you trust the weatherman,
and let's say we do,
you can trust the weather.
What does that mean?
And without the weatherman?
You cannot trust the weather.
How do you trust the weather?
When it's cold outside,
yes,
you know it's cold because the weatherman said so.
And without the weatherman?
Without the weatherman, it all seems so
random.
random.
It still seems random.
It's predictably random.
Unreliably, predictably random.
So it snowed.
I know it's universal. It's not just my opinion.
Your opinion that it snowed?
I know it snowed because the weatherman told me.
What if you missed the report?
Intuition.
Isn't that the same thing then?
I know.
In the end, it's not clear whether Jackie's tactic of putting the sky on the bottom has produced significant results. And there is still the question of trust. Why trust a prophet or prophetic experience? But we can also ask the converse. Why not trust it? What stands in the way?
Reinhold Niebuhr, the Protestant theologian, once said that original sin, which would mean the deep-seated nature of distortion of human judgment, Niebuhr said original sin is the one Christian doctrine that is empirically verifiable. And a very important contemporary Protestant theologian once said to me, it's not true. Because in order to perceive original sin, you already have to be looking at what you're doing from a religious point of view.
We live in a world that the authority became logic. If it makes sense, it's wonderful. If it doesn't make sense, it can't be. Because the human mind doesn't understand it, has no connection to what reality is. Hashem's reality is kol devei neviim emes. You don't understand it, so you don't understand it. Like many things in life you don't understand. There's something else you don't understand.
And the truth is, the more aware you are of who God is, what God wants of you, the more aware you are of the what's wrong with your own judgments.
See, it's interesting in terms of halacha.
In theory, you could imagine a human being sitting down and coming up with all the halachot that we have, with all the revealed material that we have, on their own, so to speak. I can't imagine how you would really do that, but let's say that it could be done.
If you come to do a mitzvah because you're inspired to do the mitzvah and you feel the mitzvah will bring you closer to God.
And certainly in regard to certain mitzvot, it is done. I mean, people on their own come up with many ethical principles, theft and murder and the like.
Then the mitzvah is colored by your own perception of what the mitzvah will do.
What you would be missing would be the encounter with God.
If you do the mitzvah simply because God told you to do the mitzvah, realistically, you have to begin to recognize that you may not know the reason for the mitzvah. And that any speculation is just simply speculation. But all you are left with is the statement of the mitzvah.
Because again, somebody could say, as astonishing as it may seem, you know, if you really had a human being who really, really worked everything out, you could get the right laws.
So in many ways, when you work on the level of communication, the only value that is given to the statement is the fact that it is the communication from God. That causes a very different dynamic.
Despite Plato saying that, like again in his mathematical tone of seeing is believing, the Jewish motto was just the converse. Believing is seeing. Not seeing is believing, but believing is seeing. I truly believe as if I see it.
Having nevuah, having that type of contact with God, number one, serves to bolster our faith. You know, you have a very reliable person who has had such an experience that really drives home the point there is a God.
And the other thing is believing. We believing in the caution that the prophets have urged us to be cautious about in the coming of Mashiach and the things that the ominous predictions of God forbid, that will happen if we don't behave in the proper manner. And the Yeshayahu Navi spells it out clearly that somehow we turn a blind eye to a lot of these things. We turn a deaf ear, blind eye, and we become stubbornly deaf, stubbornly blind. We become irresponsible. And when the Navi talks about the destruction, what's going to happen if you do not do A, B, C, D, and ignore it, in a sense, we're declaring that I'm a skeptic. I'm not sure. Maybe it means something else. Maybe the truth is not what it says. Maybe the truth is behind what it says. So we need to believe that Emunah Shlema, Shekol Divrei Neviim Emes, all that the prophets told us is true, whether you understand it or not.
Keep building the faith with Credo 13. Join us next week for the next root belief of the Maimonidean Creed. The prophecy of Moses is unique. Stay tuned for the men in black hats on Messages up next.
Trust. In a game, it's essential that there's trust. Trust and inspiration, inspiration and trust.
Nobody knows the answers. That's the first thing you learn.
You know, some people seem to.
It's true.
Parking attendants.
Because you don't know anything. I mean, until you know that you can't do anything. I mean, until you know that everything that you do isn't worth anything. I mean, unless there's someone else that knows everything.
You know, Josh thought I didn't see potential in the game. And, you know, I said to him, and I had to say to him, I just don't get it, you know? And he said to me something, and I'm telling you, listen, he said to me something that changed my life. This is what he said to me. That's okay. I don't get it either.